The tray of glasses slipped from Mira's hands the moment the man's fist closed around her wrist. Glass shattered across the diner floor, and every head in the room turned at once. She did not scream. She twisted her arm free, planted her feet, and shoved the drunk stranger backward so hard he knocked over a chair. "Get your hands off me," she said, her voice steady, even though her heart was slamming against her ribs. The man was twice her size, and he was not from the town. His eyes had that glassy, unfocused look of someone who had been drinking since noon, and his friends at the corner table were laughing instead of helping. Mira had worked at Elm Street Diner for 3 years, and she had learned early that no one in this town would step in for the wolfless girl. People here respected wolves. They respected strength that came from something ancient and inherited. She had neither, and everyone knew it. The drunk man lunged again, reaching for her apron this time, and Mira ducked sideways, reaching for the rolling pin she kept behind the counter for exactly this kind of night. Before her fingers closed around it, a tall figure stepped between them. She did not see his face. She only saw a broad shoulder blocking her view and felt the sudden shift in the air, the way every wolf in the room seemed to go still at once, like dogs sensing a storm. She had no wolf to warn her of danger the way theirs did, so she reacted the only way she knew how. She spun around fast, thinking the new threat was coming from behind her, and her forehead collided directly with the stranger's jaw. The sound was sharp and terrible, like a dropped plate. The stranger staggered back 2 full steps, one hand flying to his face, and the entire diner went silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Mira blinked, stars swimming in front of her eyes from the force of her own hit. "I didn't ask for help," she said, rubbing her forehead, still not entirely sure what had just happened. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. The drunk man who had grabbed her earlier was already backing toward the door, his face pale, muttering apologies to no one in particular. His friends were gone before the bell above the door even finished ringing. It was the silence that finally made Mira look up properly at the man she had struck. He was younger than she expected, maybe close to her own age, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead and a jaw that was already beginning to bruise where she had hit him. He wore plain clothes, nothing that marked him as anyone important, but the way people in the diner were staring at him told a different story. An old woman near the window had gone as white as her napkin. The cook had come out from the kitchen and was standing frozen in the doorway, wiping his hands on his apron over and over, as if the motion could undo what had just happened. "You're bleeding," Mira said, because it seemed like the only sensible thing to say. A thin line of red had appeared at the corner of his mouth. The man touched his lip, looked at the blood on his fingers, and then looked back at her, with an expression she could not quite read. It was not anger. It was something closer to disbelief, the way a person looks when the impossible happens right in front of them. "You hit me," he said, and his voice carried the kind of calm that made the words feel even stranger. "You got in my way," Mira said. "I thought you were another one of them." Behind him, 2 men in dark coats had appeared from nowhere, moving toward him with a kind of urgency that made Mira's stomach twist. They had not been in the diner a moment ago. She was certain of that. One of them reached out, as though to check the stranger for injury, and he waved the hand away without even glancing at it. "I am fine," he said, though his jaw told a different story. Mira suddenly felt very aware of the shattered glass at her feet, the eyes of every customer fixed on her, and the strange, heavy silence that had swallowed the whole diner. She had grown up without the instincts that told other people in this town when to be afraid. She could not smell fear the way they could. She could not feel the pull of hierarchy in her chest, the way wolves said they could, the invisible thread that told them who stood above them and who stood below. All she had were her eyes, and her eyes were telling her that something about this moment did not add up. "Do I know you?" she asked, because it seemed rude not to ask, and because the 2 men behind him were still watching her, like she had done something far worse than bump into a stranger. The man's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more like the beginning of one that he stopped himself from finishing. "No," he said, "you do not." One of the men in dark coats leaned close to him and murmured something too low for Mira to catch, though she saw the flicker of surprise on his face when he heard it. He glanced at her again, longer this time, taking in her flour-dusted apron, the name tag pinned crookedly to her collar, the small bruise already forming above her own eyebrow from the impact. "Your name," he said. It was not really a question. It had the shape of a request that expected to be answered. "Mira," she said, crossing her arms, "and before you decide to make a scene about your split lip, I want it on record that you walked into my elbow, not the other way around. You surprised me." Something about her tone seemed to catch him off guard. His guards, if that was what they were, looked at each other with wide eyes, as though she had said something unthinkable. She did not understand why. She had simply told the truth. The man studied her for a long moment, long enough that she started to feel uncomfortable under the weight of it, and then he reached into his coat and pulled out a card, plain and cream-colored, with nothing printed on it except a small crest she did not recognize, and a short line of elegant handwriting. "Someone will come for you tomorrow," he said, pressing it into her hand before she could refuse it. "Do not be alarmed." "Come for me," Mira repeated, staring at the card. "Why would anyone come for me? I have work tomorrow. I have a shift at 6. You will not need it," he said, and there was no cruelty in the words, only a strange, quiet certainty, as if the matter had already been decided somewhere far above her understanding. Before she could ask another question, he turned and walked out of the diner, his two companions falling into step beside him, like shadows that had been trained to move exactly when he moved. The bell above the door rang once, and then the diner was ordinary again, except that no one in it seemed capable of speaking. The old woman by the window was the first to break the silence. "Do you have any idea," she whispered, her hand pressed to her chest, "who you just hit?" "No," Mira said honestly. "Should I?" The cook let out a strangled sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been horror. "That was Cale Draven," he said. "That was the Alpha King." Mira felt the blood drain from her face, though she was careful not to let it show on the outside. She had heard the name her whole life, the way people spoke of him in low, respectful tones, the way children in town were taught to bow their heads slightly if his name was ever mentioned near an elder. He ruled over more territory than she could picture on a map, commanded a pack that stretched across 3 counties, and had a reputation for being untouchable in every sense of the word. No one questioned him, no one challenged him, no one, as far as she knew, had ever laid a hand on him without his permission. And she had headbutted him in the middle of a diner because she mistook him for a threat. "He's not going to hurt you," the old woman said quickly, seeing the look on Mira's face. "He would never harm someone without cause. But dear, you need to understand what you just did. No one touches the Alpha King carelessly, not even his own council members." "I didn't do it carelessly," Mira muttered, though her hands were trembling now that the shock was wearing off. "I did it out of pure panic." She looked down at the card still pressed into her palm. The crest on it seemed to catch the light strangely, and when she ran her thumb over the handwriting, she felt the faintest ridge, as if the words had been pressed into the paper by hand rather than printed. "Someone will come for you tomorrow." She spent the rest of her shift in a daze, sweeping up broken glass and wiping down tables, while the whispers around her grew louder instead of quieter. By the time she walked home that night through the narrow streets of the town, past houses with their windows glowing gold in the dark, she had convinced herself that nothing would actually come of it. Important men forgot small inconveniences all the time. He probably had far more pressing matters than a waitress with a heavy elbow, and no wolf to warn her when trouble was standing right in front of her. She told herself this over and over, as she climbed the stairs to her small apartment above the bakery, as she set the card on her kitchen table and stared at it while she ate a cold dinner alone, as she finally turned off the lights and lay in bed, listening to the wind outside her window. She almost believed it by the time she fell asleep. She did not believe it anymore the next morning, when she woke to the sound of a car she did not recognize idling outside her building, and a knock at her door that was polite, patient, and utterly certain that she would answer it. Mira stood frozen behind her apartment door for a full minute before she found the courage to open it. Through the thin curtain over the small window beside the frame, she could see the shape of a woman standing outside, dressed in clothes far too fine for the narrow street below, with a car parked at the curb that looked like it belonged in a different world than the one Mira lived in. She opened the door only a crack. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled, though it did not reach her eyes. "Mira, is it?" My name is Odette. I serve on the Alpha King's household staff. He would like you to come with me. I have work, Mira said quickly, gripping the edge of the door. I have a shift at the diner in less than 2 hours. Your employer has already been informed that you will not be in today, Odette said, in the same pleasant, immovable tone. He was quite understanding once he learned who was asking. Mira felt a flare of anger cut through her fear. You told my boss I wasn't coming in without asking me first. We did not want you to worry about losing your position over this, Odette said. Please believe me when I say that no harm is intended. The king simply wishes to speak with you. About what? I already apologized. Sort of. I told him the truth, which is that he walked into my elbow. Something flickered across Odette's face, something that might have been amusement quickly smoothed away. I am not able to say what he wishes to discuss. That is not my place. But I would strongly advise you to come willingly. It will make things easier for everyone, including you. Mira thought about refusing outright. She thought about shutting the door and pretending she had never opened it at all, about calling in sick to the diner herself and spending the day hiding under her blankets, until whatever storm this was passed her by. But she had grown up in this town, and she knew enough about how power worked here to understand that refusing an invitation from the Alpha King was not really a choice at all, no matter how politely it was phrased. She grabbed her coat. The car ride out of town took nearly 40 minutes, winding along roads that grew wider and smoother the farther they traveled from the diner and her small apartment above the bakery. Mira watched the scenery change through the window, farmland giving way to tall iron gates, gates giving way to a long gravel drive lined with trees so perfectly trimmed they looked unreal. By the time the estate itself came into view, a sprawling stone building with more windows than she could count. Her hands were shaking in her lap, and she pressed them flat against her knees to stop. Odette led her through a side entrance, down a hallway with polished floors that reflected the light from tall windows, and into a room that looked like a study, filled with books and a large wooden desk near the far wall. Cale Draven was standing near the window when they entered, his back to the door, and for a moment, Mira simply stared at him, trying to reconcile the calm, ordinary-looking man from the diner with the title everyone in town spoke in hushed voices. You may go, Odette, he said without turning around, and the woman left the room with a small bow, closing the door behind her with a soft click that felt far too final to Mira's ears. You didn't have to tell my boss I wasn't coming in, she said, before he could speak first. It was not the smartest opening line, she knew that, even as the words left her mouth, but she was tired of feeling like everyone around her had already decided how this conversation was going to go. Cale turned to face her, and she saw the faint bruise along his jaw, darker now than it had been the night before. I apologize for that, he said, and he sounded like he genuinely meant it, which surprised her more than anything else that had happened so far. It was meant as a courtesy, not an insult. I did not want you to lose wages because of me. Well, it felt like a threat, Mira said. Having your boss show up at my door felt like being told I don't get a say in my own life. That was not the intention. He gestured to a chair near the desk. Please, sit. I only wish to talk. She sat, mostly because her legs were tired of standing, and her nerves were tired of holding her upright through sheer stubbornness. He remained standing, arms folded, studying her, the way she imagined a scientist might study something they had never encountered before. You do not smell afraid, he said finally. I'm sorry? Every person who walks into this room is afraid, whether they show it or not. I can smell it on them the moment they cross the threshold. Fear, or an attempt to hide fear, which smells almost the same. But you, he tilted his head slightly, you smell like nothing at all, like you walked in here without a single instinct telling you that you should be careful. Mira crossed her arms. I'm plenty careful. I just don't have a wolf whispering warnings in my ear like the rest of you do. I have to figure things out the old-fashioned way, with my eyes and my brain. I know, he said. I looked into your file this morning. You were born without a wolf. It happens. Rarely. But it happens. I have never actually met someone like you before. Is that why I'm here? Because I'm some kind of curiosity? He did not answer immediately, and the pause told her more than any words could have. Partly, he admitted at last. And partly, because what happened at the diner last night is already the talk of 3 towns. My counsel believes I need to address it publicly, one way or another, before rumors turn it into something it was not. So you want me to apologize, Mira said flatly. In front of people, for an accident. No, he shook his head. I want you to work here, temporarily, under my direct supervision. It solves several problems at once. It shows that I am not a man who punishes accidents cruelly, which matters more to my people than you might think. And it satisfies my own curiosity, which I will admit is considerable. Mira stared at him, certain she had misheard. You want me to work at the palace? As what exactly? Whatever is useful, he said. You waited tables. You can assist with meals, with correspondence, with whatever needs doing. The details matter less than the arrangement itself. And if I say no, then you say no, and you go home, and I find another way to quiet the rumors, he said simply. I am not holding you here against your will, Mira. I am asking. She studied his face for a long moment, looking for the trap she was certain had to be hiding somewhere in his offer. She found none, which unsettled her more than if she had. The pay, she said finally, because practicality had always been her strongest instinct, wolf or no wolf. It has to be better than what I make at the diner, or there's no point. For the first time since she had entered the room, something like real amusement crossed his face. I can arrange that. And I keep my apartment. I'm not moving in here like some kind of prize you won. Understood. And you don't get to have your staff show up at my door again without asking me first. Ever. Agreed, he said, and this time there was no hesitation at all. Mira sat back in the chair, feeling strangely breathless, as though she had just walked away from the edge of something very tall, without fully understanding how close she had come to falling. Fine, she said. I'll do it. Temporarily. Temporarily, he agreed, though something in the way he said the word made it sound less certain than either of them intended. She started the very next day, arriving through the same side entrance Odette had led her through before, wearing her own clothes, because no one had thought to tell her otherwise, and spending her first morning at the estate, completely lost in hallways that all looked the same to her untrained eyes. She was rescued, eventually, by a young man named Leo, who worked in the kitchens, and who seemed far more amused by her confusion than sympathetic to it. You're the diner girl, he said, grinning, as he led her toward the kitchens. The one who hit the king. I did not hit him. I collided with him. There's a difference. Sure there is, Leo laughed. Everyone's talking about it. Half the staff thinks you're either incredibly brave or completely out of your mind. Can't it be both? I suppose it can, he said, still grinning, and something about his easy humor made the enormous, unfamiliar building feel just slightly less overwhelming. By the end of her first week, Mira had learned the layout of the kitchens, the names of most of the household staff, and the particular rhythm of a place that ran on rules she was only beginning to understand. What she had not expected was how often she found herself in the same room as Cale Draven, called to bring him papers, to sit in on meetings she did not fully understand, to simply be present while he worked through the endless demands of ruling a territory that never seemed to stop needing something from him. She noticed things the others around him did not seem to notice, or perhaps did not allow themselves to notice. The way his shoulders dropped slightly when the room emptied of council members. The way he rubbed at his temple when he thought no one was watching. The way every person who spoke to him chose their words with such careful precision that it was impossible to tell what any of them actually believed, only what they thought he wanted to hear. She had no such instinct to hold her tongue, and it did not take long for that difference to become impossible to ignore. 2 weeks into her strange new position, Mira had stopped flinching every time she walked past guards stationed at every corner of the estate, and had started, without quite meaning to, forming opinions about the way the entire household seemed to orbit around one man's moods, without ever admitting that was what they were doing. It happened during a council meeting she had not expected to attend. She had only been sent to deliver a folder of documents to the meeting room, but Cale had waved her toward an empty seat near the back before she could leave, and none of the council members had dared object, though several of them exchanged glances that made their disapproval perfectly clear. The meeting concerned a dispute over grazing land near the northern border, a matter that seemed, to Mira's outside ear, fairly simple to resolve. Two neighboring families had been arguing over a fence line for months, and the argument had escalated into something the council now considered a threat to regional stability. She listened as one advisor after another offered long, careful speeches about precedent and tradition, none of which seemed to actually address the fence. "With respect," said an older man near the head of the table, a council member named Percival, whose voice carried the practiced weight of someone used to being agreed with. "The correct response is to reassign the land to the family with longer standing in the territory. It preserves order. It also rewards the family that has been threatening their neighbors for the better part of a year," Cale said, though his tone was measured, careful, the tone of a man weighing options rather than making a decision. "Order matters more than sentiment, my lord," Percival said. Mira, who had been sitting quietly with the folder still balanced on her lap, found herself speaking before she had fully decided to. "That's ridiculous," she said, and the entire table turned to look at her, as if she had grown a second head. "If you reward the family that's been threatening people, you're not preserving order. You're teaching everyone in the territory that threats work. Next year, it won't be a fence line. It'll be something bigger, because they'll have learned that being aggressive gets results." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Percival's face had gone a mottled shade of red, and two of the younger council members were staring at Mira, with expressions somewhere between horror and fascination. "I did not realize the kitchen staff had been invited to offer counsel," Percival said icily. "I'm not kitchen staff," Mira said, refusing to shrink under his glare. "And I'm not offering counsel. I'm pointing out something obvious that apparently nobody at this table wants to say out loud, because it might upset the family with longer standing." "Mira," Cale said quietly, and for a moment, she thought he was about to reprimand her in front of everyone, the way she was fairly certain any sensible person in her position would expect. Instead, he turned back to the table, his expression unreadable. "She is not wrong. Rewarding the aggressor sets a precedent none of us want to defend 2 years from now." The meeting continued, though the temperature in the room had shifted noticeably, and by the end of it, the council had agreed to a compromise that split the disputed land and required the aggressive family to formally apologize to their neighbors. It was not the outcome Percival had wanted, and he made no effort to hide his displeasure as the room emptied. "You should not have spoken," he said to Mira on his way out, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "This is not your place, girl. Whatever game the king is playing with you, it would be wise to remember that you are a guest here, and guests can be asked to leave." Mira felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her chin level. "I'll remember that," she said, though she had no intention of actually changing anything about how she spoke. That evening, Cale found her in the small garden behind the eastern wing, where she had taken to eating her dinner alone most nights, away from the watchful eyes of the staff dining hall, where every conversation seemed to stop the moment she walked in. "Percival threatened you," he said, sitting down on the bench across from her without waiting for an invitation. "He implied things. It wasn't exactly a threat." Mira shrugged, though the encounter had bothered her more than she wanted to admit. "I probably shouldn't have said anything today." "You said exactly what needed saying." Cale leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Do you understand how rare that is? Every person at that table has spent decades learning how to tell me what I want to hear, instead of what is true. Percival has served 3 generations of my family, and I have never once heard him disagree with anything until you made it impossible for him not to." "That sounds exhausting," Mira said honestly. "Being surrounded by people who only tell you what you want to hear." "It is," he admitted, and there was something raw in the way he said it. Something she had not expected from a man who commanded an entire territory with what appeared to be effortless authority. "I sometimes wonder if any of them actually believe the things they say to me, or if they simply calculate what will please me fastest and repeat it back until I cannot tell the difference anymore." "Well, I don't have that problem," Mira said. "I never learned how to do the calculating part. I just say what I think, and people can deal with it however they want." "I noticed," he said, and there was the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth, quickly hidden. "It is why I have found myself seeking you out more than I probably should." Mira felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked down at her plate, unsure what to say to that. "You're the king. You can seek out whoever you want." That is precisely the problem, he said quietly. I can have anything I want, which means I never truly know if what I have is real, or simply given, because refusing me is unthinkable. You are the only person in this entire territory who has ever told me I was wrong, without calculating the cost of saying so first. The garden fell quiet around them, the last light of evening fading behind the tall hedges, and Mira found herself very aware of how close he was sitting, of the particular stillness in the air between them that had nothing to do with wolves or hierarchy, or any of the invisible threads that connected everyone else in this world except her. I should probably head back, she said eventually, though she made no move to actually stand. Probably, he agreed, though he made no move either. They sat together in the darkening garden a while longer, neither of them speaking, until the cold finally drove them both inside, and Mira walked back to her small room above the staff quarters, with her heart doing something strange and unfamiliar in her chest, something she refused to name even to herself. Word of what had happened in the council meeting spread through the estate faster than she expected. By the next morning, half the kitchen staff were treating her with a new kind of caution, as though she had suddenly become dangerous in a way none of them could quite explain, while the other half seemed almost gleeful about the whole thing, delighted that someone had finally said out loud what many of them apparently thought in private, but never dared voice. Leo found her scrubbing pots later that day, grinning as always. You made Percival's face turn purple, he said. I heard it from 3 different people already. It wasn't intentional, Mira said, though she could not quite hide her own small smile. Doesn't matter. It was glorious. Leo leaned against the counter beside her. You know people are starting to talk, right? About you and the king. Mira's hands stilled on the pot she was scrubbing. What kind of talk? The kind that makes Percival's face turn purple for entirely different reasons, Leo said, still grinning, though there was something more careful in his eyes now. Be careful, Mira. There are people in this house who have spent their whole lives climbing toward the king's favor. They are not going to enjoy watching a wolfless waitress do it without even trying. Mira thought about that warning for the rest of the day, turning it over in her mind while she worked, and though she told herself it did not matter, that she had no intention of staying at the estate any longer than necessary, some small part of her already suspected that the warning had come too late to matter at all. The letter arrived tucked beneath Mira's door on a morning she almost slept through, folded neatly in half with no name written on the outside, and when she opened it, the words inside made her blood run cold before she had even finished reading the first line. Leave before the moon turns, or everyone will learn what happens to wolfless girls who forget their place. She read it 3 times, checking the corners of the room out of instinct, even though she knew perfectly well that whoever had slipped it under her door was long gone. There was no signature, no clue as to who had written it, only careful, deliberate handwriting that gave nothing away. She thought immediately of Percival, of the cold fury in his eyes during the council meeting, but she had no proof, and accusing a man who had served the Draven family for decades on nothing but a feeling seemed like exactly the kind of mistake that could end whatever fragile place she had carved out for herself at the estate. She did not tell anyone. She told herself it was probably nothing, some jealous member of staff trying to scare her into quitting, and she went about her morning as though nothing had happened, though her hands shook slightly while she carried trays through the long hallways. It was Leo who noticed first. He always did. You look like you saw a ghost, he said, setting down a tray of bread beside her in the kitchen. What happened? Nothing, Mira said, too quickly. Leo studied her for a long moment, his usual grin fading into something more serious. Mira, I've watched you handle a drunk stranger twice your size without blinking. I've watched you argue with Percival in front of the entire council without breaking a sweat. Whatever this is, it's not nothing. She hesitated, then pulled the folded letter from her apron pocket and handed it to him. Leo's face went pale as he read it, and he handed it back to her like it had burned his fingers. You need to show this to him, he said. Today. Show it to who? You know who. Leo lowered his voice, glancing around the busy kitchen. Mira, this isn't a joke. Someone is threatening you inside the king's own house. If he finds out you kept this from him, it will be far worse than whatever happens if you tell him now. Mira knew he was right, though the idea of walking into Kale's study and admitting that someone in his own household wanted her gone made her stomach twist with something close to shame. It felt like proof of exactly what Percival had implied that day in the council chamber, that she did not belong here, that her presence had already caused enough trouble to earn threats scrawled on paper and slipped under her door in the dark. She found Cale in his study that evening, going over reports with the same tired focus she had seen so many times before. He looked up when she entered, and whatever he saw on her face made him set down his pen immediately. "What happened?" he said. It was not a question. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it once, and she watched something shift behind his eyes, a stillness settling over him that felt far more dangerous than any outburst could have been. "When did you receive this?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "This morning under my door. And you did not think to bring it to me immediately?" "I didn't want to make things worse," Mira admitted. "I know how this looks. A wolfless girl causing problems in your household, getting threatened by people who think she doesn't belong here. I didn't want to prove them right by running to you the second something went wrong." Cale set the letter down on his desk with deliberate care, though his jaw was tight enough that she could see the muscle working beneath his skin. "You did not cause this," he said. "Someone in my house decided to threaten a guest under my protection, in my own home. That is not your failure, Mira. It is a failure of my authority, and I intend to correct it. You can't punish an entire household because of one anonymous letter." "No," he agreed, "but I can find out who wrote it, and I will." He called a meeting of the senior staff the following morning, and Mira, though she had asked not to be included, found herself standing at the edge of the room anyway, watching Cale address the gathered household with a coldness she had not seen from him before, not even during the council meeting about the fence line. "Someone in this house has decided to threaten a member of my staff," he said, and his voice carried through the room without needing to be raised. "I will not name her, because she does not deserve to be paraded in front of the very people who may have written that letter. But I want it understood, clearly, by everyone standing here, that anyone found to have participated in this will not simply be dismissed. They will be dealt with as though they had threatened me directly, because in threatening someone under my roof, that is precisely what they have done." The room was utterly silent. Mira watched faces carefully, looking for any flicker of guilt, but everyone's expression seemed carefully neutral, trained by years of court life to give nothing away. Percival stood near the front, his face as unreadable as everyone else's, and Mira found herself unable to tell whether his composure was innocence or simply better practice at hiding guilt than the rest. No confession came that day, or the day after. Whoever had written the letter remained anonymous, and though Cale assigned additional guards to patrol the staff quarters at night, Mira found it difficult to sleep, her mind replaying the careful, deliberate handwriting over and over until she could recite the threat from memory. It was Leo who found the second clue, nearly a week later, tucked into the pages of a supply ledger he had been reviewing for the kitchen. A torn scrap of paper, the same handwriting, though this note was shorter, angrier, as though whoever wrote it had grown impatient with being ignored. She should have left when she had the chance. Leo brought it straight to Cale, and this time, instead of simply increasing security, Cale called Mira into his study alone. "I want to move you into rooms closer to mine," he said, without preamble, "where the guards can watch more closely." "Absolutely not," Mira said immediately. "Do you have any idea what people would say if I suddenly moved into rooms near yours? It would confirm every rumor already circulating about us, and it would make me look like exactly the kind of opportunist Percival already thinks I am." "I do not care what people say," Cale said, his voice sharper than she had heard it before. "I care that someone in my own household has threatened you twice now, and I am not willing to wait for a third letter to see how far they intend to go. And I'm not willing to let you rearrange my entire life because someone sent me 2 pieces of paper," Mira shot back, though her voice trembled slightly, despite her best effort to sound steady. "I've spent my whole life being underestimated because I don't have a wolf. I'm not going to start hiding now just because someone wants me to." They stood facing each other across the study, both of them breathing slightly harder than the conversation should have warranted, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Something had shifted in the air between them, something that had nothing to do with threats or letters or the careful boundaries either of them had been trying to maintain. You are the most stubborn person I have ever met, Kale said finally, and there was something almost helpless in the way he said it. You're not exactly easy to deal with either, Mira replied, though the anger had drained out of her voice, replaced by something softer she was not ready to examine too closely. In the end, they compromised. Mira kept her own room, but 2 additional guards were stationed near the staff quarters each night, and Kale insisted, over her continued objections, that she carry a small signal device that would summon help immediately if she ever needed it. She agreed only because Leo pleaded with her privately, reminding her that whoever had written those letters had already proven willing to threaten her twice, and pride was a poor defense against someone determined to do real harm. The letters stopped after that, at least for a while, though the uneasy feeling they left behind did not fade nearly as quickly. Mira found herself watching the household staff more carefully now, wondering which polite smile might be hiding resentment sharp enough to put threats on paper. And though she refused to let the fear change how she spoke or carried herself, it settled into the back of her mind like a shadow that refused to leave. What she did not expect was how much closer the threat brought her and Kale, how the shared danger seemed to strip away some of the careful distance they had both been maintaining, replacing it with something that felt, for the first time, like genuine trust. Autumn settled over the estate slowly, turning the trees along the gravel drive shades of gold and rust, and Mira found herself, almost without noticing, more comfortable in the vast stone building than she had ever expected to be. She still missed the diner sometimes, the easy rhythm of pouring coffee and trading jokes with regular customers, but the strangeness of her new life had begun to feel less like a temporary arrangement, and more like something she was not entirely sure she wanted to give up. It was Odette who requested her presence one afternoon, finding her in the kitchen garden where she had been helping gather the last of the season's vegetables. "The king wishes for you to accompany him to the northern village tomorrow," she said, her tone carefully neutral, though Mira had learned by now that Odette's neutral tone usually meant she had opinions she was choosing not to share. "Why me?" He did not say, he simply requested it. Odette hesitated, then added, almost reluctantly, "There is to be a gathering there. Representatives from several neighboring packs will be present, including delegates from the Ashford territory." Mira felt a flicker of unease at that. She had heard enough conversations among the household staff to know that the Ashford pack had a complicated history with the Draven territory, old rivalries that occasionally flared into something sharper than mere tension. "Is that unusual? Him wanting me there?" "Very," Odette said simply, and left it at that. The journey to the northern village took most of the morning, and Mira spent much of it watching the countryside change through the car window, trying not to notice how often Kale glanced at her from across the seat, as though checking that she was still there, still real, still willing to be part of whatever this was turning into. "You seem nervous," he said eventually, breaking the silence. "I don't do well with crowds of important people," Mira admitted, "especially crowds of important people who might not like me very much." "They will like you fine," Kale said, though there was a slight edge beneath his casual tone that told her he was not entirely certain of that himself. The village gathering was held in a large hall, decorated with banners in colors Mira did not recognize, representing packs she had only ever heard mentioned in passing conversation. She stayed close to Kale's side as introductions were made, shaking hands with delegates whose names she immediately forgot, aware the entire time of curious, calculating glances directed her way. It was during a break in the formal proceedings that a woman approached them, tall and elegant, with an easy confidence that suggested she was used to commanding attention wherever she went. "Kale," she said warmly, though her eyes moved to Mira with obvious interest. "It has been too long." "Sable," Kale said, his tone polite but noticeably cooler than the woman's. "I did not expect the Ashford delegation to include you personally." "I wanted to see for myself if the rumors were true," Sable said, her gaze still fixed on Mira. "A wolfless girl, working in the Alpha King's household, sitting in on council meetings, traveling with him to diplomatic gatherings. You must forgive my curiosity." "This is Mira," Kale said, his voice carrying a note of warning that Mira had not heard from him before. "She works closely with my household." "How interesting," Sable said, her smile never wavering. though Mira could feel the cold calculation behind it. It must be difficult, being surrounded by wolves without one of your own. Tell me, dear, do you ever feel the absence? The way we all connect to each other, the way we know instinctively who to trust and who to fear, it must be lonely, missing something so fundamental. Mira felt the familiar sting of the question, the same kind of pity dressed up as curiosity that she had endured her whole life, but she had grown tired of shrinking under it years ago. I manage just fine without it, she said evenly. I've noticed instincts aren't always right anyway. Sometimes people trust the wrong person just because their wolf tells them to, and they end up regretting it. I'd rather use my own judgment. Sable's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. How refreshingly direct, she said, though the compliment sounded more like an insult dressed in polite words. I can see why Cale finds you interesting. Sable, Cale said, his voice sharpening. Was there something specific you wished to discuss, or did you simply come to make observations about my staff? Only observations, for now, Sable said, her eyes lingering on Mira a moment longer, before she turned back to Cale with a smile that seemed designed entirely for him. Though I would be careful, if I were you. Not everyone in your council will find this arrangement as charming as you seem to. She left with a final glance over her shoulder, and Mira let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Who was that? Sable Ashford, Cale said, his jaw tight. Heir to the Ashford territory. Our families have a long, complicated history, and she has made her interest in strengthening ties between our packs known for years. Ties meaning marriage, Mira said, understanding dawning slowly. Among other things, Cale admitted, my council has pushed the idea for years. An alliance with Ashford would secure the northern border and end decades of tension between our territories. And you've never considered it? I have considered it, he said quietly. I have simply never wanted it. Something in the way he said it made Mira's chest tighten, though she was careful not to let it show on her face. They did not speak of it again for the rest of the gathering, though Mira noticed Sable watching them from across the hall more than once, her expression unreadable, calculating, the look of someone recalculating a plan that had just become more complicated than expected. The ride home was quieter than the ride there had been, both of them lost in their own thoughts, until Cale finally broke the silence somewhere past the halfway point. She is not wrong, you know, he said, about my counsel. There are those who believe an alliance with Ashford is the wisest path forward, and my continuing to avoid the subject only postpones a conversation I will eventually have to have. Are you asking my opinion? Mira asked, though she was not entirely sure she wanted to give one. I suppose I am. Mira considered her words carefully before answering. I think you should do whatever is right for your people. I'm not going to pretend I have some special insight into territorial politics. But I also think you deserve to want something for yourself, not just for the sake of an alliance on paper. And if what I want conflicts with what is best for my territory, then that's a harder question, Mira admitted. But it's still yours to answer, not mine. He was quiet for a long moment after that, watching the passing countryside, with an expression she could not quite read. You continue to be the only person who refuses to simply tell me what I want to hear, he said finally. I told you before, I don't know how to do the calculating part. I am beginning to think that is precisely why I trust you, he said, so quietly she almost missed it, and though neither of them said anything more for the rest of the journey, something had shifted between them again, subtle but unmistakable, like a thread pulled slightly tighter than before. Back at the estate, word of the northern gathering spread quickly among the household staff, and with it came new whispers, sharper than before, about the wolfless girl who had stood her ground against Sable Ashford in front of delegates from 3 territories. Percival's expression grew colder every time Mira passed him in the hallways, and though no more anonymous letters appeared under her door, she began to notice a different kind of tension settling over the estate, the quiet, watchful stillness of a household bracing for something none of them could quite name yet. Mira told herself it did not matter, that she would leave eventually, that this strange chapter of her life was still temporary, no matter how permanent it was beginning to feel. But late at night, lying awake in her small room, she found herself thinking less about leaving and more about the way Cale had looked at her in the car, the quiet admission that he had never wanted the alliance his counsel pushed him toward, and the uncomfortable, undeniable truth that some part of her had been secretly relieved to hear it. The rain had been falling steadily for 2 days when Mira found Cale standing alone on the balcony outside his study, staring out at the gray sky with an expression so distant she almost turned around and left without disturbing him. She had come only to deliver a folder of letters that needed his signature, but something about the stillness of his posture made her pause in the doorway instead. "You can come in," he said, without turning around. "I heard the door. I didn't want to interrupt if you were thinking about something important." "I was thinking about my father," he said, and the admission surprised her enough that she stepped fully onto the balcony, setting the folder down on a nearby table. "He died in this house, in the room just above this one, actually, 12 years ago now." "I didn't know that," Mira said quietly. "I'm sorry. Everyone knows the story, but almost no one ever asks about it directly. It is strange, being surrounded by people who know everything about your life and still never actually speak to you about any of it." He finally turned to look at her, rain misting faintly at the edge of the covered balcony. "I was 17 when I became alpha. My father did not train me the way he should have. He assumed there would be more time. That's a lot to carry at 17. "It was," he agreed. "I made mistakes in those first years that still follow me now. Decisions my counsel still whispers about when they think I cannot hear them. I learned very quickly that showing uncertainty was the fastest way to lose the respect I needed to keep the territory stable, so I stopped showing it. Eventually I stopped feeling it as sharply too, or at least I convinced myself I had. And now? Now I am not entirely certain what I feel most of the time," he admitted, and there was something achingly honest in the confession, something Mira suspected he had never said aloud to anyone else in this entire house. "Everyone around me reacts to what they believe I want, which means I rarely get to see how anyone actually feels about anything. It becomes difficult, after enough years of that, to trust your own reactions either." Mira leaned against the railing beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, watching the rain fall over the gardens below. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you're a better person than you give yourself credit for. Anyone who spends this much time worrying about whether their decisions are right instead of just assuming they are already right probably deserves more trust than you're giving yourself." "You are the only person who has ever said that to me and made it sound like an observation instead of flattery," Cale said, glancing at her with something soft in his expression that made her chest tighten in a way she did not fully understand. "That's because it isn't flattery. I don't really do flattery. You've probably noticed. I have noticed a great many things about you," he said, and the quiet weight of the words hung in the air between them longer than either of them seemed ready to acknowledge. Their conversations after that grew longer, more frequent, drifting into hours that neither of them seemed to notice passing. Mira found herself seeking out the small garden behind the eastern wing, not out of habit anymore, but because she knew, more often than not, that Cale would find his way there eventually, drawn by the same quiet pull that kept drawing her back as well. She learned things about him that she suspected very few people knew. That he did not actually enjoy the formal dinners his position required, though he attended every one without complaint. That he kept a small collection of books hidden in the back of his study that had nothing to do with governance or territorial law, stories he had loved as a child and never told anyone he still returned to when the weight of his responsibilities grew too heavy. That he had not laughed, truly laughed, in longer than he could remember, until one evening when Mira told him a ridiculous story about a customer at the diner who had tried to pay for his meal entirely in coins he claimed were lucky, and the sound of his genuine laughter surprised them both so much that they simply stared at each other afterward, neither quite sure what to say. In turn, he learned things about her too, that she had grown up without parents, raised instead by an aunt who never quite understood how to love a child who did not have a wolf to bond with the rest of the family's pack instincts. That she had taken the job at the diner not because she loved it, but because it was one of the few places in town willing to hire someone like her without treating her presence as a favor they were doing her. That she had never once, in her entire life, been asked what she actually wanted, only ever told what she should be grateful to receive. "You deserve better than that," Cale said one evening, when she had finally admitted this to him, the words slipping out during a quiet moment neither of them had planned. You deserve to be asked. I'm being asked now, she said softly, looking at him in the fading evening light. By you. Yes, he agreed, and neither of them moved for a long moment, the space between them charged with something neither had dared to name aloud, though it had been building for weeks now, quietly, patiently, in every conversation and every silence they had shared. It was Leo who noticed the change most clearly, teasing her gently in the kitchens whenever she returned from another evening spent in the garden, though his teasing carried an undercurrent of genuine happiness for her that made it easier to bear. You're glowing, he said one morning, grinning as he handed her a cup of tea. It's disgusting, honestly. I don't know what you're talking about, Mira said, though she could not quite hide her own smile. Sure you don't. Leo's grin softened into something more sincere. For what it's worth, Mira, I've worked in this house a long time. I've never seen him like this. Not once. Whatever is happening between you two, it's real. Anyone with eyes can see that. She did not respond, but she carried his words with her for the rest of the day, turning them over in her mind while she worked, allowing herself, for the first time since arriving at the estate, to imagine a future here that extended beyond the vague, temporary arrangement she had agreed to weeks ago. It frightened her, how easily the idea had settled into her chest, how much she wanted it, despite every instinct telling her that wanting something this large, this impossible, was asking for heartbreak she was not prepared to survive. But some nights, lying awake in her small room listening to the rain against her window, she let herself imagine it anyway, just for a little while, before she reminded herself of everyone who stood against it, and the danger that had already made itself known once, and the fact that whatever this was between them, it had not yet been tested by anything harder than quiet conversations in a rainy garden. That test, though neither of them knew it yet, was coming faster than either of them expected. The summons came on a gray morning, delivered not by Odette, but by one of Percival's own assistants, a thin young man who refused to meet Mira's eyes as he informed her that the full council required her presence within the hour. She had never been formally summoned before, only ever included at Cale's invitation, and the difference set her nerves on edge the moment she stepped into the council chamber and saw the number of unfamiliar faces seated around the long table. Cale was already there, standing near the head of the table with an expression carved from stone, and she knew immediately, from the tightness around his eyes, that whatever this meeting was about, it was not going to be pleasant. Sit, Percival said, gesturing to a single chair positioned at the center of the room, isolated from the others, in a way that felt deliberately designed to make her feel exposed. She sat anyway, refusing to let her discomfort show. We have called this meeting, Percival began, addressing the room rather than Mira directly, because concerns have been raised about the growing influence of a member of this household who holds no formal position, no pack affiliation, and no accountability to this council. Say what you actually mean, Percival, Cale said, his voice cutting through the formal language with obvious impatience. Very well. Percival turned to face Mira directly for the first time. There are those among us who believe your presence here has become a liability. You have inserted yourself into matters of governance you have no training to understand. You have accompanied the king to diplomatic gatherings where your presence created friction with allied territories. And now, we have received information suggesting your background may not be as simple as it first appeared. Mira's stomach dropped. What information? Percival produced a folder, sliding it across the table toward Cale rather than her. Records suggesting that the aunt who raised you was, for a time, in contact with individuals connected to territories hostile to this pack. Records suggesting your presence here may not be entirely accidental. The accusation hit Mira like a physical blow. That's insane, she said, her voice rising despite her effort to stay calm. My aunt worked at a grocery store her entire life. I don't even know what territories you're talking about. Perhaps you do not, Percival said, his tone maddeningly reasonable. Or perhaps you have played your part very well. Either way, the council cannot in good conscience allow someone with these connections, however distant, to remain embedded in the king's household with the level of access you currently enjoy. Cale had gone very still, flipping through the folder with an expression Mira could not read, and for one terrible moment, she feared even he might believe what Percival was suggesting. "Where did you obtain this?" he asked finally, his voice dangerously quiet. "Through channels this council maintains for precisely this purpose," Percival said, verifying the backgrounds of those given access to sensitive matters. "These records are 20 years old," Cale said, setting the folder down with deliberate care. "They reference a woman who apparently had a passing acquaintance with someone tangentially connected to a territory that has not existed in its previous form for over a decade. This is not evidence of anything, Percival. This is a story constructed from fragments, and you know it." "Perhaps," Percival allowed, "but perception matters as much as truth in matters of governance, my lord. And the perception among many in this territory is that a wolfless girl with unclear loyalties has gained unprecedented access to the king's confidence. Whether or not the connection is real, the doubt itself is a vulnerability we cannot afford to ignore." The room was silent, every council member watching the exchange with careful, guarded expressions, and Mira felt, for the first time since arriving at the estate, truly and completely alone. She looked at Cale, searching his face for some sign of reassurance, and found instead an expression she could not quite decipher, something caught between fury and something that looked uncomfortably like doubt. "I would like a moment to speak with the council privately," Cale said finally, and Mira understood, with a sinking feeling, that she was being asked to leave. She stood without a word and walked out of the chamber, her legs feeling strangely disconnected from the rest of her body, and made her way blindly through the hallways until she found herself back in the small garden behind the eastern wing, the place that had become, over these past weeks, the closest thing to safety she had found in this enormous, unfamiliar house. She did not know how long she sat there before Leo found her, his face pale with worry. "I heard what happened," he said, sitting down beside her. "The whole staff is talking about it already." "They think I'm some kind of spy," Mira said, her voice hollow. "Based on nothing. Based on my aunt supposedly knowing someone who knew someone, 20 years ago." "Nobody who actually knows you believes that," Leo said firmly. "Percival is using this as an excuse. He's wanted you gone since the day you argued with him in that council meeting, and this gives him the perfect cover to push for it, without looking like he's simply threatened by you." "It doesn't matter if it's true," Mira said. "It only matters if enough of the council believes it, or pretends to believe it, to force him to send me away." She did not see Cale for the rest of that day, and the silence felt like its own kind of answer, one she was not prepared to accept, but could not seem to argue against either. That evening, alone in her small room, she began, almost without deciding to, packing her few belongings into the same bag she had arrived with weeks earlier, telling herself it was simply practical to be ready, not an admission that she had already given up. She was still packing when the knock came at her door, soft and hesitant in a way that was completely unlike Cale's usual confidence. She opened it to find him standing there, his expression exhausted in a way she had never seen before, and behind him, she noticed with some surprise, no guards at all. "You are packing," he said, his eyes moving past her to the half-filled bag on her bed. "I thought it might save everyone the trouble," Mira said, though her voice cracked slightly on the words. "Do not," he said, and the raw urgency in his voice stopped her cold. "Please, do not decide this for both of us before I have had the chance to say what I came here to say." She stepped back, allowing him into the small room, and waited, her heart pounding, for whatever came next. Cale stood in the doorway of her small room for a long moment before he finally spoke, and when he did, his voice carried none of the careful control she had grown used to hearing from him in council meetings and formal gatherings. "I told them no," he said, "after you left the chamber. I told the council that the accusation against you was baseless, and that I would not remove you from this household, based on 20-year-old rumors about a woman who has nothing to do with the territories they fear." "And they accepted that?" Mira asked, though something in his expression told her the answer before he spoke. "Not entirely." He rubbed a hand across his face, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked genuinely tired, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with a single difficult conversation. "Percival has agreed to drop the matter of your background. But he has made it clear that he and several others on the council believe your continued presence here, regardless of the reason, undermines the stability of my rule. They believe I am allowing personal feelings to interfere with decisions that should be made with the territory's interests in mind. Are they wrong? Mira asked quietly. Kale looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that made her breath catch in her chest. No, he admitted. They are not wrong. I have been allowing my feelings to interfere with nearly every decision I have made since the night you struck me in that diner. I have told myself for weeks that my interest in keeping you here was simply curiosity, or gratitude for your honesty, or a desire to quiet the rumors that first brought you to this house. I do not believe any of those explanations anymore, and I suspect I stopped believing them a long time before tonight. Mira's heart was pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Then what do you believe? I believe, he said slowly, choosing each word with obvious care, that you have become the only person in this entire territory whose presence I actually look forward to, rather than merely tolerate. I believe that the idea of you packing that bag and leaving tonight is far more frightening to me than anything Percival or his allies on the council could ever threaten me with. And I believe that I have spent so many years being told what to feel, and when to feel it, that admitting this to you now is the most honest thing I have said to anyone in longer than I can remember. The room felt very small suddenly, the space between them charged with everything neither of them had said aloud until this moment. Kale, Mira started, though she was not entirely sure what she meant to say next. I am not asking you to stay because the council demands it, or because it would be convenient, he continued, before she could finish. I am asking because I do not know how to imagine the rest of my life in this house without you in it, and that terrifies me more than any political consequence Percival could threaten me with. Mira felt tears sting the corners of her eyes, though she was not entirely sure if they came from fear or relief, or something else entirely, something she had spent weeks refusing to name even to herself. This is dangerous, she said, for both of us. Percival isn't going to stop just because you told him no tonight. And I don't have anything to offer this territory except honesty and a strong right elbow. I'm not a diplomat. I'm not an heir to some allied pack. I'm just a girl who happened to walk into your life by accident. I do not want a diplomat, Kale said. I have an entire council full of them, and not one of them has ever told me the truth as plainly as you have. I do not need you to be anything other than exactly what you already are. And if the council never accepts me, if this causes real damage to your territory, to your alliances, to everything you've spent your whole life building, then we face that together, he said simply. But I refuse to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had let you walk out that door tonight, simply because it would have been easier than fighting for something real. Mira looked down at the half-packed bag on her bed, then back up at him, and felt something inside her chest finally settle, the fear and doubt of the past few hours giving way to a quiet, steady certainty she had not expected to feel so completely. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I've never been in a position where someone actually wanted me to stay, not out of obligation or pity, but because they genuinely wanted me here. Neither have I, Kale admitted, a small, genuine smile breaking through his exhaustion for the first time that evening. Perhaps we can figure it out together. She crossed the small distance between them, and when he reached for her hand, she let him take it, feeling the warmth of his fingers closing around hers with a certainty that felt, for the first time in this entire strange and unexpected chapter of her life, completely and undeniably right. They did not solve everything that night. Percival remained a threat, his allies on the council still murmuring their disapproval through the hallways of the estate, and Sable Ashford's cold, calculating interest had not simply vanished because Kale had made his feelings known to a wolfless waitress from a small border town. But something had changed between them that night, something neither the council's disapproval nor the political complications of their situation could easily undo. Mira unpacked her bag the next morning, placing her few belongings carefully back into the small dresser she had come to think of, however reluctantly, as her own. She did not know what the coming weeks would bring, whether Percival would find some new angle of attack, whether the growing rumors throughout the territory would eventually force a confrontation neither she nor Kale could fully control. But for the first time since she had arrived at this enormous, unfamiliar house, she felt something close to hope, steady and quiet, settling into the place where fear had lived for so many weeks. Leo found her in the kitchen garden later that morning, and one look at her face told him everything he needed to know before she said a single word. "You're staying," he said, grinning widely. "I'm staying," Mira confirmed, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. The days that followed settled into something quieter than Mira expected, though the quiet felt fragile, like the calm stretch of sky before a storm gathers strength somewhere just out of sight. Percival kept his distance, polite and formal whenever their paths crossed, though Mira had learned enough about him by now to recognize that his silence was not surrender. It was patience, the kind of patience that came from decades spent waiting for the right moment to act. It was Odette, of all people, who finally broke through the careful distance she had maintained since Mira's first day at the estate. She found Mira in the garden one crisp afternoon, carrying 2 cups of tea, and sat down without being invited, an unusual gesture from a woman who had always been so carefully proper. "I owe you an apology," Odette said, handing her one of the cups. "When you first arrived, I treated you the way the rest of the household did, as a curiosity or a problem to be managed. I was wrong to do that." "You don't owe me anything," Mira said, though she accepted the tea gratefully. "I do," Odette insisted. "I have served this family for many years, long enough to watch the king grow from a frightened 17-year-old boy into the man he is now. I have never seen him as unguarded as he has been these past weeks. Whatever concerns Percival and his allies raise, I no longer share them. You have been good for him, Mira, in ways none of us expected." The kindness in Odette's words settled something anxious in Mira's chest that she had not fully acknowledged carrying. It was not the council's approval, not by any means, but it was something, a small crack of warmth in a household that had felt so guarded and cold when she first arrived. That evening, Cale found her in their usual spot in the garden, though his expression carried a seriousness that told her immediately something significant weighed on his mind. "I want to speak with you about something," he said, sitting down across from her, "and I want you to know that whatever you decide, I will respect it completely." "That sounds ominous," Mira said, trying to keep her voice light despite the sudden nervousness twisting in her stomach. "The council has requested a formal gathering," he said. 3 weeks from now, they wish to discuss the future of my position, including matters of succession and alliance. Percival intends to use the gathering to formally propose the Ashford alliance once more, and I suspect he will use it as an opportunity to publicly question your place in this household as well." Mira felt her stomach drop. "So this is it. The confrontation you've been trying to avoid." "Yes," Cale admitted, "and I need to know, before that gathering arrives, exactly what you want. Not what you think I want to hear, not what you believe would be easiest for me politically, what you actually want. For yourself, for us, for whatever this has become between us." Mira was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over carefully in her mind before she answered. "I want to stop being afraid of what people like Percival think of me," she said finally. "I've spent my whole life being told I'm less than everyone around me because I don't have a wolf. I came here expecting that to be true here too, just with higher stakes and better furniture. But it's not true, Cale. I contribute something to this household that none of your council members ever could, precisely because I don't have a wolf telling me who to fear and who to trust. I want that to matter as much as bloodline and pack alliances seem to matter to everyone else in this territory." "It does matter," Cale said firmly. "It matters more than any alliance Percival could propose." "Then I want you to stop trying to protect me from this fight," Mira said, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "I don't need you to shield me from the council's disapproval. I need you to stand beside me while I face it myself. That's the only way anyone in this territory is ever going to believe I belong here. If they see it isn't just your feelings keeping me in this house, but my own choice to stay and fight for it." Something shifted in Cale's expression, admiration mixing with something that looked almost like relief. "You continue to surprise me," he said quietly, "every single day." "Good," Mira said, allowing herself a small smile despite the weight of what was coming. "I'd hate to become predictable." They spent the following weeks preparing carefully for the gathering, Cale briefing her on the political intricacies of territorial alliances, the history between the Draven and Ashford packs, the delicate balance of power that had kept the region stable for generations. Mira absorbed it all with the same sharp attention she had once used to memorize the diner's busiest customers and their particular preferences, determined not to be caught unprepared when the moment finally arrived. Leo and Odette both offered their support in quieter ways, Leo teaching her enough about pack customs and etiquette to avoid any obvious missteps during the formal gathering, Odette helping her understand which council members might be persuaded, and which had already made up their minds long before the meeting even began. Sable Ashford sent a letter 3 days before the gathering, formal and polite on its surface, though the underlying message was impossible to miss. She looked forward to renewing the conversation about alliance, and hoped that recent distractions within the Draven household would not interfere with matters of far greater importance to the stability of the region. Kale's jaw had tightened reading it, but Mira found, to her own surprise, that the letter did not frighten her the way it might have weeks earlier. She had spent too many nights now sitting in that quiet garden, learning the true weight of Kale's responsibilities, understanding the depth of what he carried, to feel intimidated by a woman whose confidence came from expectation rather than genuine connection. The night before the gathering, they sat together in the garden one final time, the autumn air sharp with the promise of winter not far behind. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Kale said, taking her hand in the darkness, "I want you to know that my decision is already made. I am not attending this gathering to decide between you and the alliance Percival wants. I am attending to make clear, once and for all, that the decision was never truly in question. You don't know what the council will do," Mira said softly. "They could refuse to recognize me. They could pressure you into something you don't want." "They could try," Kale agreed. "But I have spent 12 years learning how to lead this territory, and I have never once, in all that time, felt as certain about anything as I feel about this." Mira squeezed his hand, feeling the steady warmth of his fingers around hers, and allowed herself, finally, to believe that whatever tomorrow brought, she would not face it alone. The great hall had never looked so full. Every council member sat in their formal seats. Delegates from allied territories filled the rows behind them, and near the back, Sable Ashford watched the proceedings with an expression of calm confidence that did nothing to hide the sharp calculation behind her eyes. Mira stood near the center of the room, her back straight, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart, and waited for Percival to begin what she knew would be the most difficult conversation of her life. "We gather today," Percival began, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, "to address matters vital to the future stability of this territory. Foremost among them, the question of alliance, and the question of certain influences that have taken root within this household in recent months." He turned, deliberately, to look at Mira. "I do not raise this matter out of cruelty," he continued. "I raise it because this council has a duty to protect the interests of every pack within this territory, and that duty requires clarity about who holds influence over decisions that affect us all." "Then let me provide that clarity," Kale said, rising from his seat before Percival could continue further. His voice carried none of the careful diplomacy she had seen him use in smaller council meetings. This was the voice, Mira realized, of a king who had made his decision and intended for every person in that hall to understand it completely. "3 weeks ago," Kale began, "a woman with no pack, no wolf, and no inherited claim to any position of influence in this territory struck me, quite by accident, in a diner near the northern border. She did not recognize me. She did not calculate the political weight of her actions, because she had no reason to. She acted only on instinct, the very human instinct to defend herself against a threat she believed was standing in front of her." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through parts of the hall, though it faded quickly under the weight of Kale's continued expression. "In the weeks since," he went on, "that same woman has sat in council meetings and told me the truth, when every advisor in this room chose comfortable silence instead. She has faced threats within my own household, with more courage than many trained guards I have employed. She has stood before delegates from rival territories and refused to apologize for her own honesty, even when doing so would have been far easier than holding her ground." He turned to look directly at Mira now, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I did not choose Mira because of political calculation, or because I believed her presence would strengthen alliances or secure borders. I chose her because she is the only person in this entire territory who who has ever spoken to me as though I were simply a man, rather than a title to be managed and appeased. That is not a weakness in my judgment, as some of you have suggested. It is, I believe, the clearest judgment I have made in the 12 years I have led this pack. Percival's face had gone pale, though he tried to maintain his composure. My lord, with respect, sentiment cannot replace the practical necessities of governance. The Ashford alliance would secure decades of stability along our northern border. Perhaps it would, Cale acknowledged. But stability built on an alliance neither party genuinely wants is a fragile thing, Percival, no matter how solid it appears on paper. I would rather build this territory's future on something real, even if it is more difficult to explain in formal terms, than on an arrangement that satisfies tradition while leaving everyone involved unhappy. He turned to address the full hall now, his voice steady and certain. I understand that some among you have doubts about a queen without a wolf, without inherited claim, without the traditional qualifications this council has always required. I understand those doubts, because I held some of them myself, before I came to know her. But I ask each of you to consider what true leadership requires. Not merely instinct, not merely inherited authority, but honesty, courage, and the willingness to speak truth, even when silence would be safer. Mira has demonstrated all three, more consistently than anyone else who has ever sat at this table. The hall was utterly silent as he finished speaking, and Mira felt every eye in the room settle on her, waiting. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. I know I'm not what any of you expected, she said, addressing the council directly. I don't have a wolf to guide my instincts. I can't offer this territory an alliance with another pack, or generations of inherited authority. What I can offer is what I've always offered, since the night I accidentally struck your king in a diner he wasn't even supposed to be visiting. Honesty. I will always tell the truth, even when it's inconvenient. Even when it would be easier to simply agree with whatever this council wants to hear. I believe that matters. I believe it matters more than bloodline. And I believe, given time, I can prove that to every person in this hall. Sable Ashford rose from her seat near the back, her expression carefully composed. A moving speech, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. But sentiment does not secure borders, my lord. I came here today prepared to discuss a genuine alliance between our territories. I would hate to see that opportunity discarded so easily. I have never intended to discard it, Cale said. I value the peace between our territories, Sable, and I am prepared to discuss trade agreements, mutual defense arrangements, and any number of practical alliances that do not require marriage to secure. What I will not do is choose a wife based on political convenience, when my heart has already made a different choice, one I believe will serve this territory far better in the years to come. Sable studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, resignation settling in, alongside the calculation that had always defined her presence. Very well, she said finally. I will not pretend this is the outcome I hoped for, but I have no wish to stand against a king so clearly certain of his own path. We will discuss other arrangements then, and leave matters of the heart to those brave enough to claim them. She sat down, and a murmur moved through the hall, uncertainty giving way, slowly, to something that felt almost like acceptance. Percival remained standing a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before he too finally lowered himself back into his seat, defeat evident in the set of his shoulders, even as he said nothing further. Cale turned to Mira, and in front of the entire assembled hall, he took her hand. I make this choice, not as a king bound by duty, he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room, but as a man who found something in a diner 3 weeks ago that he never expected to find in this life. Mira, will you stand beside me, not as an accident of fate, but as my choice, freely and completely made? Mira felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back, refusing to let this moment be anything other than exactly what it was, a choice made in full view of everyone who had once doubted her. Yes, she said, her voice steady and clear, I will. The ceremony that followed happened faster than Mira ever could have imagined, the formal traditions of the territory bending, for perhaps the first time in generations, around a union that had nothing to do with inherited bloodlines or calculated alliances. Odette stood near the front of the gathered crowd with tears in her eyes, and Leo, unable to contain his grin, stood just behind her, looking prouder than Mira had ever seen him. As the final words of the ceremony were spoken, and the crown was placed, gently and deliberately, upon her head, Mira thought back to the drunk stranger in the diner, to the accidental collision that had upended her entire life, to every moment of doubt and fear that had led her to this exact point. She had spent her whole life being told she was less than everyone around her simply because she lacked something everyone else took for granted. Standing now in front of an entire territory, chosen not by instinct or inheritance, but by genuine, deliberate choice, she understood finally that her difference had never been a weakness at all. It had been, all along, exactly what made her enough. Cale took her hand, as the hall erupted into applause, and when he looked at her, his expression held none of the careful control she remembered from their very first meeting, only warmth and certainty, and something that looked, unmistakably, like joy. 3 weeks ago, he murmured, just for her, you gave me a bruised jaw and told me I got in your way. I stand by that assessment, Mira said, smiling despite the tears finally slipping free. I would not have it any other way, Cale said, and as the crowd continued to cheer around them, he leaned down and kissed her, sealing a choice that neither the council, nor tradition, nor any calculated alliance could ever have predicted. The wolfless waitress, who had once been overlooked by an entire town, now stood at the very center of it, not because fate had chosen her, but because she had chosen, every single day since that first accidental collision, to remain exactly and unapologetically herself. And in the end, that had been the only qualification that ever truly mattered.